I just ordered 5 books, 2 volumes of Ovid, including letters from Pont, and 1 volume of Virgil, basically Aeneid, and 2 volumes of tragedies by Euripides. So it's safe to say that I liked Ovid's Metamorphoses. It was a buddy read with Lukash from Totally Pretentious. It was easier to pronounce when the channel's name was Lukash's Books. So we read Ovid's Metamorphoses this month. I read it in Russian and in English, and English edition I used the one moment the sorry guys, Penguin Classics edition, new translation. I will leave a link to it into info box. The translator's name David Raeburn. Sorry guys. Let's talk first about the translations. I like them both for different reasons, and I also had some complaints about both of them. Let's start with the English one. The reason I liked it is because of the critical apparatus, as Steve Donoghue calls it. So there are a lot of footnotes, there are articles before the poem. It's very informative, and the translator did a great job to simplify the poem for us a bit. You know, every god or goddess or smaller goddess or nymph or whatever can be called by about 10 names. For example, Apollo can be called Feb, can be called the driver of a sun chariot, can be called by his father. Jupiter's son can be called by his mother. Latonia's son can be called by the place where his temple is, by Delphi. So English translation sometimes insert the name of Apollo so we couldn't understand whom we are talking about, or just change the less known name for the god to Apollo. So it's easier to understand, and it has a lot of footnotes, and it's a very beautiful translation. But sometimes I think the language was too modern for me, and the poem was written in dactylic hexameter, so it's all about rhythm and not about rhythm. And sometimes I couldn't find the rhythm in the English translation, and magically it was changed from poetry into prose when I couldn't find the rhythm. But it might be my fault because English is not my native language. About Russian translation, it was very beautiful. It wasn't very informative. Footnotes wise, we just have about 20 pages of footnotes, maybe less. It's not very informative. And the language sometimes, very rarely, some words were in low key register, like they would be okay if you talk to your buddies in a pub, but I don't think that they suit to this translation, that they should have been used in this translation of a poem about gods and heroes and what's not. So I have some small complaints about both of them. About structure, it's a very long poem, about 15 books they're called, but they're very small. So the idea was to gather all the myth about gods and different godlike creatures, well, myth of Greece and Rome, and some myth about heroes, like about Trojan War, about Julius Caesar and the Emperor Octavius. Sorry, guys. So Ovid gathered all these stories and connect them to each other and connected them to each other and wrote this very long poem from the creation to the time of the Roman Empire. And it's very beautiful. It's very interesting. You should pay attention to the way the stories are connected. For example, it might be some theme. For example, there is a story about Apollo killing a huge snake that was terrorizing the humankind, the population of entire Greece. So he's killing this snake with arrows, and we have arrows. Then he happens to pass, having just killed the snake, he happens to pass a Cupid who is playing with arrows. And he says to Cupid that arrows are a man's weapon, that he, Cupid, shouldn't play with them, that they are not for children. Of course, Cupid, after that, will have his revenge. He shoots the arrows, one into Apollo to ignite his passion for a nymph, Daphne, and another in Daphne, so that she wouldn't want to have anything to do with Apollo. And we have this story about Daphne being transformed into a I think olive tree. I don't remember much of the symbols. I think it was olive tree. So the main idea of the poem is change. So basically, I had this idea that almost every tree or every bird, according to Ovid, some time ago was a man or a woman. So it's basically about Metamorphoses, about change of a human being into a plant, in a tree, or a bird, or any kind of animal. And it's very interesting, sometimes a bit tiring. So I have some notes. Sorry. Let's talk about surprises. That poem was full of stories. They were intricately connected. There were stories inside stories. Some of them were tragic, some of them were kind of ridiculous and hilarious. Sorry, guys. And it also was full of surprises. First of all, I tried to see the society behind the poem, the society for whom Ovid wrote it. And I loved to see all the bits and pieces of information they had back then about religion of Egypt, religion of India, and I think they even had some notion about Spain. Of course, they knew much about these countries because Ovid writes this poem many years after Alexander the Great, many hundred years after Alexander the Great. So of course they knew about Egypt and India, but I was somehow pleased with these bits and pieces. I was very curious, and it was very interesting to see how they explained earthquakes and rainbows and volcanoes eruptions and and climate change, the change of seasons. It was very interesting. Also, I was pleased. Sorry, guys. I was pleased to see that attitude towards women has changed. Sorry. This is a collection of myths of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And as far as I remember, women in this myth were perfectly happy to become lovers of Jupiter and Apollo and the other different gods because they were gods, they were beautiful. So women were supposed to fall in love with them, to fall in love with them immediately. Ovid changes his attitude towards women, and I wonder how much Lucretia has had to do with it, with her suicide. If you remember this story, she was raped by Sextus Tarquinius, who was an Etruscan king's son, so he was a heir to the throne. He wasn't exactly a god, but he was pretty close, considering that he would become a king. And she wasn't happy about that. She told everything to her husband and committed a suicide, and it led to a rebellion, and Roman kingdom ended, and the Roman Republic raised. Sorry. So maybe it was her achievement So in Russian translation, it all told very softly. You understand that all these women that gods choose, in most of the cases they are not exactly willing, so there are words used like taken advantage of, being taken advantage of, forced. But English translation, the Russian translation was made at about 1983, and the English translation, I understand, is quite modern. So the translator calls a spade a spade, and calls a rape a rape. But unfortunately, as I understand it, reading between the lines, the victim of the rape was at that time kind of to blame for the rape, because all these girls, all these virgins that Diana saved by turning them into birds and plants and whatever, it's, for me it looks very much like death. And for me it means if you didn't commit suicide before the rape, so it's your own fault. Of course I'm reading into it, I'm reading between the lines, but that's what my thoughts were. Also, according to Ovid and the stories he telling us, it was quite natural for a man to be in love with another man, but it was unnatural to a woman to be in love with another woman, or to want to stay a virgin. So in first case, she would need the help of a goddess to turn this woman into a man, and in the second case, she would be most likely turned into a bird, into a tree, into some kind of animal. Also, there are two stories, one of an incest and another of intended incest, and in both cases women are to blame. So it's still not perfect world, but the stories are, the poem, the stories, they are quite enjoyable nevertheless. The biggest surprise was that, to sum up it all, I haven't expected it at all. To sum up it all these changes, Ovid tells us that we shouldn't eat animals because we have a soul, and this soul, it can enter an animal as easily as it can enter a human being. So we could be eating our own relatives, our own grandparents, so, for example. I didn't expect that. It was very surprising. And he also talks about different kind of changes, about time, about age, about Troy cities, that Troy was a great city, and now Troy is ruined, and now Rome is the greatest city in the world, and Julius Caesar was a great man, but now Augustus Caesar is even a greater man. So Julius Caesar is dead, but Augustus is the greatest leader in the world. And he tells that Augustus, I'm sorry guys, I have no idea how to pronounce his name. So this Caesar, the first Roman emperor, he was Julius Caesar's son. He tells that he was born of Julius Caesar, which isn't true, because he was a nephew. I have no idea how to tell it. He was a kind of a nephew of the age of a grandson to Julius. So he was adopted. He wasn't born of Julius Caesar. So it makes the entire poem for me a propaganda. So the entire poem was kind of written to tell us that, to claim that Augustus is a son of Julius Caesar and that he surpassed his father in everything. So I would say that it's better if you have already read Iliad, Odyssey, and Aeneid, and before you read Metamorphoses. Well, it was mostly very easy to understand, all the stories. But the chapter 14, I knew all the words, but it was still Greek to me. It was incomprehensible, and I think it's because I have no idea what happened in Aeneid, what happened after the fall of Troy. But you can read it now and then reread it after reading Iliad, Odyssey, and Aeneid. It's quite enjoyable, it's very interesting, and with a good footnotes, it's easy to understand. Even if you don't know who this nymph is and who this god is, you can still enjoy the story. And about the stories themselves, Lukash has already posted his video, and he gave a lot of very good, wonderful examples and talked about them in detail. And most of them are my favorite stories too. I only just like to add that I liked the story where after the plague, which killed most of the population of a city or of a kingdom, to replenish the population, ants were turned into men. That was very interesting. It was another change from animal to a human being. And I liked very much a story about Cadmus and his wife. As a young man, Cadmus kills a sacred snake. And as an old man, after suffering great losses, he is turned into a snake himself. And his wife decided to become a snake too, so that she wouldn't have to part with him. It was very moving. I liked the story. And the description in Metamorphoses, the descriptions, they are very vivid and sometimes very graphic. For example, the description of a ship being wrecked and sank by a sea storm, or a description of bloodbath that happened at 2 different weddings. They were very graphic and very dynamic and exciting, not exactly a good word, fascinating. They were fascinating and they reminded me of a blockbuster of a Hollywood movie. um, I think that's about all. Well, as I said, Ovid's Metamorphoses is quite enjoyable even now, when our way of life, our beliefs and opinions are so different to the ones that were common for the Roman Empire. So I liked it very much. I think you should try to read it. Thank you for watching. Goodbye and happy reading.